An entitled CEO threw his coffee at a royal guard, thinking his wealth and status could buy him immunity. But when the guard finally broke silence, the businessman learned that some things can't be purchased. Not respect, not dignity, and certainly not escape from consequences. Here's how his empire of arrogance crumbled in seconds. But before we continue, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Subscribe to the channel because tomorrow at the same time, we'll bring you another story of courage and discipline from the royal guards that you won't want to miss. A sleek black Bentley pulled up at the Tower of London as Richard Blackwell pushed the door open before his driver could reach it, barking orders into his phone. "Davis, they're bleeding capital and we both know it," Richard snapped, his tailored suit impeccable despite the long ride from Canary Wharf. "Offer 60% and not a penny more. Remind them I can wait while their shareholders cannot." At 46, Richard had built Blackwell Ventures into one of London's most aggressive private equity firms. His prematurely silver hair gave him a distinguished appearance that masked the calculating coldness in his steel-grey eyes. "Sir, your meeting is in 20 minutes, his assistant James reminded him, clutching an expensive leather portfolio. "They've reserved the private dining room as requested." "About time they showed proper respect," Richard muttered, barely acknowledging the young man. He checked his watch impatiently at the security checkpoint, eyeing the line of tourists with disdain. "Surely we're not expected to queue with the general public. Make sure they know who I am." As James hurried ahead, Richard noticed a royal guard standing at his post, perfectly still in his scarlet tunic and bearskin cap. Morning light glinted off his brass buttons and rifle barrel. Richard's lip curled. Grown man playing dress-up, standing around like a statue while the rest of us generate the tax revenue that pays his salary. The guard remained motionless, focused straight ahead with practiced discipline. Richard never noticed the campaign medals visible on the guard's chest or the subtle signs of a man who had seen combat before ceremonial duty. Such details were beneath the notice of a man who measured value solely in pounds. "Sir, they're letting us through now," James called. Richard strode forward, deliberately passing close to the guard. "Must be nice," he said loudly, "standing around while real business happens around you. Some of us have empires to build." A middle-aged couple exchanged disapproving glances, the man's military bearing and regimental tie suggesting he understood far more about the guard's position than Richard ever would. "Come along, James," Richard called. "Let's get this meeting over with. Some of us have actual work to do today, unlike our decorative friend here." Richard's meeting in the Tower restaurant lasted precisely 90 minutes. The exact time he allotted for closing the acquisition deal he'd been pursuing for 3 months. The restaurant manager hovered nervously as Richard signed the final papers with a flourish, then immediately rose from the table without bothering to finish the expensive wine he'd ordered. "Have the car brought around, James," he instructed, already taking another call as he strode from the private dining room. "Donovan, talk to me about the Singapore numbers." His voice echoed in the ancient stone corridor as he made his way toward the exit, barely noticing the historical surroundings that tourists travelled thousands of miles to see. Outside, the midday sun had brought more visitors to the Tower grounds, families and tour groups clustered around guides who spoke in reverent tones about the centuries of history contained within the walls. Richard cut through them impatiently, his phone conversation growing increasingly heated. "That's completely unacceptable," he snapped, stopping abruptly and causing James to nearly collide with him. "We projected a 12% return minimum. If Wong can't deliver that, find someone who can." He listened for a moment, his face darkening. "I don't care about market conditions. I care about results." The call dropped suddenly, the signal lost within the thick stone walls of the ancient fortress. Richard glared at his phone in disbelief, as if it had personally betrayed him. "James, get my network provider on the line," he demanded. "This is the 3rd dropped call today. I pay them enough to expect better service." He looked around, realizing they had wandered into the section of the grounds where the royal guard he'd seen earlier was still standing at his post, perfectly motionless despite the increasing heat of the day. The same middle-aged couple Richard had passed earlier was now standing at a respectful distance, the man explaining something quietly to his wife about the Guards' regiment and history. Several tourists were taking photos, maintaining the appropriate distance marked by the subtle barriers. "Ridiculous," Richard muttered, pocketing his useless phone and watching the guard with growing irritation. "Standing there like a mannequin while people gawk. Is this really what British taxpayers are funding?" James shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, perhaps we should head to the gate. Your next meeting—" "In a moment," Richard cut him off, his day's frustrations finding a convenient target in the stoic figure before him. "I want to see what's so special about this particular tourist attraction." He approached the guard, stopping just short of the marked line that visitors were expected to respect. The guard remained perfectly still, eyes fixed forward, bearing the full weight of his ceremonial uniform without the slightest indication of discomfort despite the midday heat. "Excuse me," Richard said loudly, as if addressing a server in a restaurant. "I seem to have lost my signal. Can you point me toward the nearest exit?" The guard gave no response, maintaining his disciplined silence and stillness. A few nearby tourists turned to watch, some exchanging uncomfortable glances at Richard's deliberate breach of etiquette. "I'm speaking to you," Richard continued, his voice taking on the edge that made junior executives tremble. "It's basic courtesy to answer when someone asks a question. Or does wearing that costume exempt you from common decency?" The middle-aged man with the regimental tie stepped forward slightly. "Sir," he said quietly, his accent marking him as a former military officer, "the guards are not permitted to speak or move while on duty. It's tradition dating back centuries." Richard turned to him with barely concealed contempt. "And you are?" "Colonel Edward Hamilton, retired," the man replied evenly. 25 years with the Royal Regiment of Fusiliers." "Well, Colonel," Richard said, emphasizing the title with subtle mockery, "perhaps it's time to update traditions that serve no practical purpose. In the corporate world, we call this inefficiency." The colonel's wife placed a gentle hand on her husband's arm as he stiffened slightly. "The guard is performing his duty exactly as required," the colonel replied, his voice remaining measured. "It would be appropriate to respect that duty." Richard's phone rang suddenly, saving him from having to respond. "Donovan, what happened?" he barked into it, turning his back to the colonel dismissively. As he listened, his face darkened further. "Unacceptable. Tell Wong either he delivers the projections as agreed, or I'll have his position by the end of the week." The call grew increasingly heated, Richard pacing back and forth directly in front of the guard, deliberately intruding into the space most tourists respected. His voice rose, drawing more attention from visitors trying to enjoy the historic site. "I don't build billion-pound companies by accepting excuses," he nearly shouted into the phone. He turned and gestured toward the guard. "Look, even this toy soldier here understands his job is to stand exactly where he's told and do exactly what he's told. If he can manage that with no apparent skills, surely your team of supposedly elite analysts can deliver the numbers I require." Colonel Hamilton's expression grew grave, but he maintained his own military discipline, watching the scene unfold with growing concern. Several families began moving away from the area, parents ushering children from the escalating situation. "Sir," James attempted to intervene, as Richard ended the call, "perhaps we should continue to your next appointment. The car should be waiting." "In a moment," Richard snapped, his gaze fixing back on the guard with the focused intensity he usually reserved for hostile takeovers. "First, I want to understand why we're all supposed to stand in awe of someone whose entire job is to impersonate a statue." The afternoon heat had intensified, causing tourists to seek shade beneath the ancient stone archways of the tower. The guard remained at his post, sweat barely visible at his temples, the only indication that he was flesh and blood, rather than the statue Richard had compared him to. His discipline never wavered, his posture remaining parade ground perfect, despite the rising temperature and mounting tension. Richard stepped deliberately into the guard's line of sight, his expensive aftershave cutting through the historic atmosphere as he positioned himself mere inches from where propriety dictated he should stand. His silver hair caught the sunlight as he tilted his head, studying the guard with the calculating gaze he typically reserved for businesses he intended to dismantle. "You know what fascinates me," he announced, loud enough for the remaining tourists to hear. "In the real world, the world of business and finance, we measure value by contribution, by output, by results." He gestured dismissively at the guard's immaculate uniform. "But here we have a grown man, presumably with some basic training, whose entire job consists of standing still while wearing a costume from the last century." James hovered anxiously several feet back, his knuckles white around the leather portfolio. Colonel Hamilton and his wife remained nearby, the colonel's military bearing becoming more pronounced as his concern deepened. Several other visitors had stopped to watch, their expressions ranging from embarrassment to indignation on the guard's behalf. "Do you have any idea what I accomplished this morning while you were standing here?" Richard continued, circling the guard like a predator. "I closed a £60 million acquisition. I restructured a failing tech company that will now employ 300 additional people. I made decisions that will ripple through the economy for years to come." He stopped directly in front of the guard again. "What exactly did you contribute to society today, besides serving as a photo opportunity for tourists?" A mother quietly ushered her young children away, whispering something that sounded like, "That man is being terribly rude," as they departed. An American couple watched with evident discomfort, the husband shaking his head slightly. "Sir," Colonel Hamilton stepped forward again, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone used to commanding respect. "This guard is a serving soldier in His Majesty's Armed Forces. Before being assigned to ceremonial duty, he likely served in combat zones around the world. This post is considered an honour, given only to those who have demonstrated exceptional discipline and service." Richard turned, his expression making it clear how little the explanation impressed him. "An honour? Standing like a department store mannequin is considered an honour?" He barked a laugh that contained no actual humour. "In my world, Colonel, we honour excellence with compensation and advancement, not by turning skilled people into tourist attractions." The colonel's wife whispered something to him, but he gently shook his head. "Each button on that uniform, each medal, each ceremony has been earned through service that dates back centuries. These men don't just stand guard over buildings, they stand guard over traditions that define us as a nation." "Charming sentimentality," Richard replied dismissively. "But sentimentality doesn't drive innovation or economic growth. It doesn't create jobs or shareholder value." He gestured at the guard's ceremonial rifle. "That's precisely what's wrong with this country. Too much looking backward. Too much clinging to outdated traditions. Not enough forward thinking." His phone rang again, cutting through the tense atmosphere. Richard answered immediately, his tone shifting to the razor-sharp business voice that had become his trademark in boardrooms across London. "Blackwell here, talk to me." As he listened, his expression darkened to something dangerous. "What do you mean they're backing out? The papers are already signed." He began pacing again, each step bringing him closer to the invisible boundary around the guard's post. "They can't legally withdraw now. Tell legal to prepare for immediate action." The call clearly wasn't going as Richard wanted, his free hand clenching into a fist as he listened. "Unacceptable. Completely unacceptable. We had terms. We had an agreement." His voice rose with each sentence, drawing more uncomfortable glances from the remaining tourists. "I don't care about their concerns. I care about the contract they signed, not 3 hours ago." James took a tentative step forward, recognizing the dangerous signs of his employer's temper reaching critical mass, but he was too late. Richard spun toward the guard, phone still pressed to his ear, his face flushed with fury. "You see this?" he shouted, clearly addressing both the person on the phone and everyone within earshot. This is what's wrong with everything today. No accountability, no respect for agreements. This guard stands here because he's told to stand here, following orders without question, while the rest of us do the actual work that keeps the world running. The colonel moved to intervene more directly, but Richard was now completely consumed by his anger. The dropped Singapore deal and the collapsing acquisition merging into a perfect storm of rage that needed an outlet. Some of us have to make the hard decisions, take the real risks, he continued, his voice rising further. Some of us have to fire people and restructure companies and make the calls that determine whether businesses live or die. And what do we get? Clients who renege on deals and employees who fail to deliver and politicians who lecture us about responsibility while they've never created anything of value in their lives. His pacing had become more agitated, cutting a path that repeatedly violated the respectful distance other visitors maintained. A tower warden appeared at the edge of the area, alerted by concerned tourists, but hesitated as he assessed the situation. "Sir, please," James attempted, "your next meeting." "Don't interrupt me," Richard snapped. Turning back to his call, he barked, "Tell them if they think they can walk away, I'll bury their company so deep they'll need archaeological permission to find what's left of it." He ended the call with a violent jab at his phone screen, then rounded on the guard once more. "And you just stand there, don't you? No concerns about market fluctuations or contract breaches or quarterly projections. Just stand there in your fancy dress costume while people like me deal with the actual complexities of the real world." His voice had taken on a dangerous edge, the same tone that preceded the firing of entire executive boards. Must be nice to have such a simple existence, to contribute so little, yet be treated with such unearned respect. The air around the guard seemed to grow heavier, charged with tension. Though he remained perfectly still, there was something in his bearing now, some subtle shift that those with military experience might recognize as the coiled readiness of a soldier preparing for action. Colonel Hamilton recognized it immediately, taking a step forward with new urgency in his movements. "That will be quite enough, sir," the colonel said firmly. "You've made your point, whatever it might be. I suggest you move along before this situation deteriorates further." Richard rounded on him, the full force of his boardroom intimidation tactics focused on the retired officer. "Or what, Colonel? Will he attack me with his ceremonial rifle? Will the palace dispatch the royal cavalry?" His laugh was ugly and sharp. "This isn't the Empire anymore. These aren't the days when men in red coats could command respect simply by showing up." The colonel didn't back down, his own military bearing becoming more pronounced. "That soldier has earned his position through service. You couldn't begin to comprehend. He likely has more discipline in his little finger than you've demonstrated in this entire disgraceful display." For a moment, it seemed Richard might actually launch into a physical confrontation with the elderly officer. Then his phone rang again, breaking the standoff. He glanced at the screen, then answered with a bark. "What now, Davis?" As he listened, his face transformed from anger to outright fury. Without warning, he spun back toward the guard, the phone still pressed to his ear, his control finally snapping completely. "What do you mean they're pulling out completely?" Richard's voice vibrated with barely contained rage as he glared at the guard, though his words were directed into the phone. "The deal was solid. The papers were signed. I was there 3 hours ago." His free hand clenched and unclenched repeatedly, the veins on his temple visibly pulsing as he listened to whatever devastating news his associate was delivering. The remaining tourists had backed away further, forming an uncomfortable semicircle at what they deemed a safe distance. The tower warden had moved closer, but remained hesitant to intervene directly with someone of Richard's obvious wealth and status. "Reputation concerns. Their reputation!" Richard nearly shouted, his face flushing a dangerous shade of red. "Tell them about my reputation for destroying companies that cross me. Tell them what happened to Westbrook Industries when they tried to back out of terms." James took another tentative step forward. "Sir, perhaps we should continue this conversation in the car. Your blood pressure—" "My blood pressure is not your concern," Richard snapped, silencing his assistant with a glare that had withered far more confident men. Turning back to his call, he continued, "No, I will not consider a reduced offer. It's the agreed terms or litigation that will last until their grandchildren retire." The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the scene, the ancient stones of the tower seeming to absorb and radiate the heat. Despite this, the guard remained perfectly still, not a single drop of sweat visible on his face. His discipline unwavering, even as the confrontation before him escalated. The only sign of his awareness was an almost imperceptible tightening around his eyes, a detail noticed only by Colonel Hamilton, who recognized the subtle signals of a soldier maintaining composure under extreme conditions. "Fine, fine!" Richard suddenly shouted into the phone. "Tell legal to prepare every possible action. I want injunctions filed by close of business today. I want their board members personally named in the suit. I want—" He stopped abruptly, pulling the phone from his ear to stare at it in disbelief. "They hung up on me," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "They actually hung up on me." The silence that followed was heavy, pregnant with the anticipation of the explosion everyone present could sense was coming. Richard's knuckles turned white around his phone, his breathing becoming shallow and rapid as the full impact of the collapsed deal crashed over him. £60 million, 3 months of negotiation, countless hours of planning, all evaporated in a single phone call. His eyes fixed on the guard, who continued to stare straight ahead, maintaining his duty with perfect composure despite the escalating scene before him. Something about that stoic discipline, that unflinching adherence to duty, seemed to finally push Richard over the edge. "Look at you," he said, his voice taking on a new, more dangerous quality. "Standing there like nothing matters, like the world isn't falling apart around you." He took a step closer, deliberately violating the space any reasonable person would have respected. "Do you have any idea what I just lost because of incompetent people who can't honor their commitments? Do you have any idea what real pressure feels like?" Colonel Hamilton moved forward with new urgency. "Sir, I must insist you step back immediately." But Richard was beyond hearing reason now, consumed by a rage that had been building throughout his stressful day, now seeking any available target. In his right hand, he still clutched the expensive takeaway coffee he'd been nursing throughout the confrontation, a specialty blend from an exclusive cafe that catered to London's financial elite. "You think standing there makes you important," he spat, his voice shaking with fury. "You think that uniform commands respect just because it's old, because it's tradition? Let me show you what I think of your precious traditions." What happened next occurred so quickly that many of the witnesses would later give conflicting accounts. Richard's arm moved in a sudden violent arc, the coffee cup leaving his hand with deliberate force. The dark liquid arced through the air, splashing across the guard's immaculate scarlet tunic and bearskin cap, staining the ceremonial uniform that had been meticulously prepared that morning. A collective gasp rose from the onlookers, the shock of the moment freezing everyone in place. Even James stepped back, horror evident on his face as he realized the line his employer had just crossed. The coffee dripped slowly down the red fabric, creating darker patterns against the bright colour, droplets falling to the ancient stones below. For one breathless moment, the guard did not move, did not speak, did not give any indication that he had just been assaulted. Coffee trickled down his face, soaking into the collar of his uniform, yet his eyes remained fixed forward with the same unwavering discipline. This momentary continuation of duty protocol, even in the face of such a deliberate provocation, somehow made Richard's actions seem all the more outrageous. "There," Richard said, a cruel smile of satisfaction twisting his features. "Now you have something real to think about while you stand there playing statue. A little taste of the real world where actions have consequences." Colonel Hamilton's face had gone pale with shock, then flushed with a controlled anger born of decades of military discipline. He stepped forward, placing himself between Richard and the guard. "You have just assaulted a serving member of His Majesty's Armed Forces while on duty," he said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "That is a serious criminal offence." Richard barked a dismissive laugh. "Assault! Please, I spilled a drink. Call it a gratuity for his performance." He brushed an imaginary piece of lint from his tailored sleeve, the momentary satisfaction of his action already fading as he confronted the persistent reality of his collapsed deal. If his precious uniform can't handle a coffee stain, perhaps he shouldn't be on public display. Then, with a deliberate and controlled motion, the royal guard stepped forward. There was no hesitation, no wasted movement, only the precision of a man trained for moments exactly like this. When he finally spoke, his voice carried not the practiced cadence of ceremony, but the quiet, commanding authority of a soldier prepared for battle. "Step back, sir." 3 simple words that cut through the tension like a blade. Richard froze, momentarily speechless at hearing the statue speak. The guard's eyes remained locked on his, containing not anger but something more unsettling, the measured assessment of a man who had faced genuine threats. "I am Sergeant David Mitchell, King's Guard, formerly Royal Marines Special Boat Service." His voice remained level, professional. "I have served 3 tours in Afghanistan, 1 in Iraq, and operations elsewhere I'm not at liberty to discuss." He didn't move from his position, maintaining perfect military bearing despite the coffee staining his uniform. "This uniform you've just defaced dates back to 1660. Each button, each medal, each stitch represents centuries of service and sacrifice." Colonel Hamilton stepped forward. "Sergeant Mitchell holds the Military Cross for Valour under fire. Before standing guard here, he led operations that directly saved British lives." Tourists had begun recording the confrontation on their phones. Richard attempted to regain his composure, straightening his tie. "This is ridiculous. It was just coffee." "No, sir," the guard replied evenly. "What you've done is assault a serving member of His Majesty's Armed Forces while on duty. That carries serious legal consequences." The tower warden had been joined by 2 police officers who had been patrolling nearby. They approached with measured caution, assessing the situation. "This uniform," Sergeant Mitchell continued, "was prepared with 5 hours of work this morning. Each crease, each fold, each polish represents the discipline and attention to detail that keeps soldiers alive in combat zones." Richard's face flushed deeper. "You can't be serious. Do you know who I am?" "I know exactly who you are, Mr. Blackwell. Your identity makes no difference. This isn't your boardroom where wealth equals authority." The police officers had reached them now. "Sir, we need you to step back," one said to Richard, placing herself between him and the guard. "This is absurd," Richard sputtered. "I spilled a drink. You're treating me like a criminal over a cleaning bill." Colonel Hamilton's voice carried the weight of decades of service. "What you've done, sir, is deliberately disrespect and assault a symbol of this nation's commitment to service and sacrifice." The second officer was speaking quietly into his radio, and within minutes 2 more uniform officers appeared, along with a man in plain clothes who identified himself as military police. "Mr. Blackwell," the plainclothes officer said, "you're being detained for assault on military personnel performing ceremonial duties which falls under the Armed Forces Act." Richard's face contorted with disbelief. "This is insane. I'll have all your jobs for this. Do you have any idea who you're dealing with?" "Yes, sir, we do," the officer replied calmly. "And right now we're dealing with someone who has committed a documented offence against a serving member of His Majesty's Armed Forces." Sergeant Mitchell still hadn't moved from his post, the coffee continuing to stain his uniform. Only when his commanding officer arrived and formally relieved him did he step away, his bearing remaining impeccable, despite the humiliation he'd endured. "This is a mistake you'll all regret," Richard declared, as he was led to a private room within the tower for initial processing. I have the Home Secretary's private number. I've donated to the current government's campaign. This will be sorted within the hour." The military police officer, who introduced himself as Captain Lewis, remained unmoved. "Sir, I understand you're upset, but threats won't help your situation. Assaulting a guard on ceremonial duty is taken very seriously." "Assault? It was coffee," Richard protested, reaching for his phone. "James, call Gerald at the Home Office immediately, then get our legal team on standby." James, who had followed at a distance, looked distinctly uncomfortable. "Sir, I don't think that would be appropriate at this stage." Richard stared at his assistant in disbelief. "Excuse me?" "Sir, I witnessed what happened. You deliberately threw your drink at the guard. I can't in good conscience call in favours to circumvent proper procedure." For perhaps the first time in his professional life, Richard found himself without loyal support. His face flushed with a new kind of anger. "You're fired. Pack your desk tomorrow." James nodded quietly. "I understand, sir." He placed the leather portfolio on the table and stepped back. "I'll need to provide a witness statement before I leave." Captain Lewis continued the processing with professional detachment. "Mr. Blackwell, we have multiple witnesses, including several who recorded the incident. The evidence is quite clear." Richard's phone began ringing incessantly. News travelled fast in London's financial circles. He glanced at the screen and saw his chairman's name. "I need to take this." "By all means," Captain Lewis said, sliding a document across the table. "While you do, here's information about the charges being considered." Richard scanned the document, his face paling slightly as he realised the potential severity. The Armed Forces Act specified significant penalties for interfering with military personnel on duty. His call connected, and the chairman's voice was ice cold. "Richard, what the hell is happening? I'm seeing videos on social media of you throwing coffee at a king's guard." "It's being handled," Richard replied, attempting to project confidence. "A minor misunderstanding." "Minor? The board has called an emergency meeting. Our largest client just called me personally to express concern about your pattern of behaviour." Outside the window, Richard could see Sergeant Mitchell, now in a fresh uniform, marching with perfect precision back to his post. Despite everything that had happened, the guard resumed his duty with unwavering discipline. The contrast between his composure and Richard's collapsing world striking everyone who witnessed it. What would you do if you witnessed someone disrespecting a royal guard? Would you have had the courage to step forward like Colonel Hamilton did? If this story taught you something about respect for tradition and service, hit that like button and share it with someone who might need this reminder. Don't forget to subscribe and press the bell icon so you never miss our daily stories about respect and dignity. See you tomorrow with another powerful story. Until then, you can watch our previous videos appearing on your screen right now.